Welcome to the Metta Life Podcast. I'm your host, Laura. Come with me on a journey to a healthy life. On today's episode, Justine and I talk about discovering who you are. Justine, welcome to this podcast. Can you please tell our listeners who you are and where you're from?
Hello. So good to be here. I'm first and foremost Laura's friend, an honor. And I'm Justine, and I am always flustered by this question. It totally depends who I speak to. I often change the answer, or if I say to people, do you want the long answer? And they don't always. I was born in Costa Rica to parents who are from Canada, and I moved when I was 7 to the Cayman Islands, and from there to England to finish schooling. And already I have made a little lie because I always skip over the fact that my family went sailing for a year. Because when I moved to England, I was 13. And to be 13 and a girl, the last thing you want is to be different. So I never tell anyone that my family went sailing for a year. And it's something I'm trying to shake as an adult. But now I've been in England on and off with some time in Antarctica and 7 months living in Cuba. And now back in England.
Okay, I just realized something. So you have a scar here on your eye. Is that from an accident when you were sailing?
No, it was on the boat, but it was a few years after.
Okay, because I remember you telling me that you injured yourself on the boat, and all of a sudden I was wondering, is that related?
No, same boat, but a few years after.
Okay.
So I did a backflip off the boat and I missed the water. I hit the boat.
Ouch. Ouch. Okay, let's speak about happier things.
Yes.
How many countries have you lived in? And how many nationalities do you have? And why?
So I have lived in, I think 4, maybe 5 countries. Costa Rica, the Cayman Islands, England, and Cuba.
Nice.
And in some ways I have also lived in Canada because I go back every summer to see my grandparents. So I've not lived there, but I have some cultural connections, and I carry 4 passports.
I've never met anyone with 4 passports.
I'm not actually sure you're supposed to.
But did you buy any of them?
Didn't buy any of them, although everyone does wonder about the Cayman Islands passport.
Okay, tell us the story, because 4 passports without buying any of them is very rare.
I have the Canadian from my parents, so you can get it you can just pass it to your children. And then I had a Caymanian passport from my dad, who has found his forever home. He's also a bit nomadic like the rest of my family. And so we lived there, and I went to primary school. And he's going to be there forever. So through him, we have status. And then England, well, it was very difficult coming into England and explaining to the border guard, oh yes, my Caymanian passport means I can study here. They never liked that. So yeah. I went through the process of getting a British passport. Excuse me, I have an eyelash. And I had to do the Life in the UK test.
Really?
What is the national vegetable of Wales?
What is it?
It's a leek.
Oh, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. And then last year I went back and I lived in Costa Rica again for a year as an adult, which was very interesting because it was a place I had left as a 7-year-old. So it smelt familiar, but I didn't know how to navigate it. And while living there, I was able to convert my citizenship card, a cedula, into a passport.
So the second time you lived in Costa Rica?
I got the passport, yeah.
Okay.
So I didn't buy any of them.
I'm reassured. But how come you have traveled so much in your life? Because you have lived in 4 different countries, you have 4 different nationalities, and you're one of the most well-traveled person I know. How come?
I mean, unavoidable. It's definitely privilege, and it comes from my parents. They have always been slightly black sheep of their family. And so shortly after they were married, they moved to Costa Rica, and they lived there for 5 years before I was born. And my mum, she is still traveling at the moment. She's having a gap year when she's 60. So it is funny when she goes, oh, my girls, they never live in the same country. And I think it's your fault. We have moved so much. So they always wanted us to see as much of the world as possible. And that's also why they took us sailing. So they took us out of school for a year, and we lived on a boat, and we went around the world.
Yeah. And now as an adult, because you don't seem to have traveled less since you're 18. So what drives you to traveling, and what are you looking for when you do that?
I think a lot of the traveling I have done and the going and living abroad is really a rejection of convention. So when I finished university, and so many of my friends and people my age were moving to London and doing what they were supposed to do. And that never sat well with me. But I think we spoke about this the other day, Laura, the idea that if you're running away from something, it's also not necessarily a free decision.
Yeah.
So the idea, I was constantly trying to sort of leave, and then you would come back, and then you're never quite anywhere, are you? But I mean, also it was I think a wanderlust, to use that word, and a desire to see the world.
Yeah.
So that really drove some of my more recent ones, Costa Rica and Cuba. And some of that as well was refinding an earlier identity. You know, I don't look Latina. I'm not going to necessarily claim that identity as mine. But in some ways, to go back and to know a culture and to speak the language was a way of returning as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes complete sense. But I'm wondering, how do you figure out who you are? I already find it so difficult when you know your roots, you've lived in the same place. Well, I can't say I know because I haven't done it, but I can imagine it must be maybe easier to know exactly who you are and what you stand for when your life has been shaped in a way that is very familiar to you. So how do you find and discover who you are when you are all over physically?
This is such a good question. And it's one I've been trying to flip recently. Because for a lot of my life, I was never enough anywhere. So I would go to Canada to see cousins, and I wasn't Canadian enough. You know, I would understand maybe half the joke or half the references, but I would miss the full story. Or I had friends who say, well, it would be different if you lived here.
Oh, that's painful.
That's a bit rude. We're not friends anymore.
Good. Good.
But no, the idea that, you know, you were only there for a short amount of time, so you didn't qualify.
Yeah.
And same for going back to Cayman to see my dad. And it's funny, the whole time I lived in England for school and university, everyone was asking me, your accent, it's weird. You're not from England. And very much people try and define you by not.
Yes.
And I've been trying to think, actually, what I have is so special because I'm comfortable everywhere. And so recently I have been going back to places and thinking, wow, like I can make it somewhere that I know how to navigate. And even like silly things like going to the supermarket.
Okay, I need to stop you for a second. There are two things that stand out to me. People define you by who you are not. Can you talk about this for 1 second? And then the second question I would like to discuss with you is, what is home to you? If everywhere you go, people tell you, you're not really from here. So what makes something home for you?
Such a good series of questions. So the first one was about people defining me as not. That, yeah. So it's fascinating. Can I use my sort of English British identity for that one first?
Go for it.
When I worked on ships, which is even more sort of unrooted. And oddly enough, that's when I felt most British. And
Can you please explain to our audience for 1 second what you did on ships? Because I find it fascinating.
I worked as a historian on the small ships, the small cruise ships that would go down to the Antarctic. So we would have a very mixed global crew. And it was interesting because while being in England, I had been defined as not English. Abroad with English people, I was able to say, I recognize the humor. I recognize the sort of small linguistic differences, even within English. And I felt more at home with those people than, say, with a kind of Canadian, even though my parents come from there. And so it was working abroad, oddly enough, that made me feel that I could come back to England and say, no, I'm British.
Okay.
Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it's also learning about how not to let people define you, right? So, and I think that's a lifelong attempt, isn't it?
So right now, if I ask you, you would tell me you're British?
I would probably say, yeah.
Okay. Because when I met you many years ago, lifetimes ago, for me, I always thought of you as a citizen of the world. And you do sound English to me, very much so. But again, English is not my native language. So someone who has kind of an English accent to me is like kind of English, but I knew a bit about your background and I was like, yeah, Justine comes from all over the world. And now you're telling me you consider yourself English, British. I love it. I love it. And I think a few years ago when we met, you wouldn't have given me that answer.
No, and I think it's shifting. And yet from being in Costa Rica for a year, I had a friend wish me happy birthday by looking me up on the Cédula Nacional, where everyone is registered, to wish me a happy birthday using my official census records, because that's where I was born. So I'm always registered there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
And it made me feel like a tica again. So a little bit of everything.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. That's how I see you. And,
more positive though.
Yeah, in the best possible light. Yeah. And so you have such a strong sense of self, but how do you manage it when people are like, yeah, you're not from here, go? How do you make it your home when you're somewhere, even though people tell you this is not your home? It's
tricky. I won't lie. And it's interesting because some people are very adamant about saying, no, you are not something. But I often think, or I try to think now, obviously when I was younger, I was a teenager in England, I didn't know how to respond. But now it's, well, clearly that's because you're not quite sure where you belong.
Yeah.
Or where your sense of self is. But it's tricky.
Yeah. And so would you say home is more linked to what you feel, or is it linked to geography? Is it linked to heritage? What is it for you?
To people.
To people.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question, the idea of home. And it's something I've learned from my mother, who has always made us a home wherever we were. And so I've taken that into when I've been as an adult moving to new places. So it's very small pedestrian things, making a routine, making things around you familiar, and learning how to sort of integrate yourself into a place. I am now looking back on the time I lived in Cuba as something with pride.
Yeah.
I didn't know anyone. And by the time I left, I threw a goodbye party and 30 people came, and I had a boxing club and friends who I could wander down the street to.
That's amazing. And you also make a conscious effort to learn the language everywhere you go. And it's not a given.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And it's very lonely.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I like to think...
And how do you overcome the loneliness when you're trying to discover who you are in a place that is foreign?
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
Because I think you carry a lot of, you go all the way to somewhere, but you're still there.
Yeah.
And so the loneliness is hard, I think. And Cuba was very interesting because I lived there before Wi-Fi had been introduced. So I think unlike most people...
When was that? Which year, more or less?
I was 2018.
Okay. To me, it was more recent. I don't know why, but the world has kind of shifted.
I know.
Between your time in Cuba.
It's been a while.
Yeah, so that's maybe why I feel like it's been longer.
It does feel like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
But I don't think people are, because we have phones and stuff. I was so alone. I have not spent that much time with myself ever, before or after. I would come home from work. I lived alone. And the door would close and I would think, oh my God. And I could call, I had a number of one girl I'd met through like a friend of a friend's husband who said, you guys are doing similar work, but I only met her a month in. I could call my dad. And sometimes I would feel really lonely and I would walk back to work and I would linger outside the building to get Wi-Fi.
I actually remember this. You were like, yeah, I'm outside of work.
I was like, hi, Laura. I'm just crouched on the corner. It was good for me. It was yucky at the time. I remember the first month I thought, ugh, I don't like this. I don't know how to spend time with myself. I read a lot of books. I fell back in love with reading. But it was good for me.
Was that solitary experience an advantage to further discovering who you are?
I think so, because it gave you that kind of hard stop where it was no one else is coming.
You don't have distractions.
You don't have distractions, and you say, well, if you want to do something, like you have to pick yourself up and go. I try and carry it through, although I think I have got lazier.
So if anyone, maybe who doesn't have the same background, but maybe who hasn't traveled so much, doesn't have full passports, but like to anyone who is trying to figure out who they are in this world. And I find it very difficult considering we are constantly bombarded with social media, images of what we're supposed to look like and be and feel. So could you give us a few advice on how to discover who you truly are and how to live your best life?
Those are big questions. I think I need my own advice a lot of the time because I still
We
sometimes
all need
wonder.
our own advice.
But I would say it's the disconnecting when you were saying bombarding.
Yeah.
It's so true. And it's even worse now. I mean, even looking back to 5 years ago when I lived there, we didn't have the same Instagrams and everything that I think are very negative. So if I'm not very good at it, but I can. And sometimes when we go back to Canada, there's no Wi-Fi up at my granny's.
Oh, good.
And it's delicious because then you put your phone away and you don't talk to anyone. And it takes me at least 4 or 5 days to relax, if not longer, because you're so used to being there for people or replying or keeping up to date with stuff. But if you can disconnect and then quiet down enough to see, and then it sounds trite to say this, but be uncomfortable.
I agree with you.
It sounds so silly and it sounds so easy to say, but it can be really small things.
Yeah.
Like doing a podcast with Laura.
Yeah. Doing things that take you out of your comfort zone and test your boundaries. Yeah.
And it's hard because I think as you get older, I find that friends, and even friends who I totally love and respect, people tend to get comfortable. So then you have to make even more of an effort to go slightly out of the expected lane. But it's worth it, I think.
So I did a few things to take me out of my comfort zone. The first one was I started climbing and I have fear of heights, and now I've conquered it and I'm very proud of myself for this. But
You should be. It's really impressive.
thank you. But for the longest time I was a boxer and I was a human rights lawyer, and I didn't want to be defined by what I did anymore. And to not be defined by what I did and to really discover the true essence of who I am, I wanted to try different things and see how things felt for me, and not have the outside world telling me, Laura, you are this and you are that, and I put you in that box. It's very restraining to be in that box. And it's very freeing to be like, you know what? I did things that scare me, like I started climbing and I'm doing a podcast now, which I never thought in a million years I would be doing. And this allows me to continue discovering who I am, be truer to myself, but it's hard and it's painful and it's very uncomfortable.
That's the thing about being out of your comfort zone, is that when you look back, you go, oh my goodness, I had a most amazing time in Cuba. And I learned about myself and I spent time on myself. Oh my God, I used to sit at home sometimes and just like cry.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even aesthetic.
I mean, who cries in an aesthetic way?
The lighting was terrible. And, but no, and even just this last year, I had a friend say to me, she says, you do realize you're doing something new.
Yeah.
Because I started a law degree this year and it was awful. Doing something new is awful. And I think so few people do it because it is uncomfortable. But then you come out the other side when it isn't new anymore. And that's, I think, where you start to build up more and more pebbles of what makes you you.
Oh, I love it.
I've realized I've been searching for so long, and I've been saying recently, I don't have a sense of self. But actually it's trying to think of it in the more positive way of, no, I have lots of little pieces of me. And sometimes they feel a little scattered, but sometimes you sort of think, no, actually, and each of those pebbles, to continue with this metaphor, are something I've worked on. You know, being alone or traveling a lot or trying a new degree, and then together.
Yeah, and it's not constant.
Sense. Yeah.
It's not because one day you feel like, okay, I'm this person, that it means tomorrow you will be the same person. Thankfully, we evolve and change. And I think we should remember that the people we love change and evolve as well.
And surround yourself with people who will let you change.
Oh, God. Yes, I could.
Because a lot of people don't. And a lot of people are threatened by it.
Yeah. Okay. So to summarize, to discover yourself, you suggest disconnect from social media. You suggest...
And I should take my own advice.
We should all take this advice. All of us. And then you suggest doing things that scare you and that make you go outside of your comfort zone.
But while being kind to yourself, because my parents always said to be out of my comfort zone, and it sometimes became something I hit myself with like a stick. And there are ways of going out of your comfort zone that are still compassionate. Like the way that you learned how to climb and get over your fear of heights is such a good example for me of going out of your comfort zone in a way that is still compassionate.
Yeah.
And not just, Catholic misery. In suffering there is goodness.
Yes. And the last advice, which I found very profound, is surround yourself with people who let you change and appreciate your change.
And who celebrate your change.
Yeah. This is amazing advice. Well, Justine, it has been incredible talking to you, and we end every episode with a few burning questions. Are you ready?
So ready.
Yes. So the first burning question is, what do you want most out of this life?
I want to swim every day.
Oh! We went swimming this morning. We went swimming. And it was a bliss.
Being by water is my happy place.
Good. You need to move here.
I'll move here.
And then please complete these sentences. The world needs more.
Can I say 2 things?
Yes. There are no rules here.
I think it needs more compassionate people.
Yeah.
And I think it needs more vernacular architecture.
Okay, please expand on the second one.
When you go somewhere and all the buildings look the same no matter where you are. I think buildings are so important because they are repositories of people's history and they should reflect the place.
Yeah.
It's also more environmentally friendly to build vernacular.
I love it. I love this perspective.
Such an obsession with old buildings.
Well, you're a historian, so it does make sense. And I am grateful for?
I'm grateful for the people who love me.
Oh, I love you, Justine. And I'm grateful to have you in my life. And finally, the most important of all the questions on the podcast.
I'm ready.
Are you ready? If there was one thing I could cook for you, what would it be?
Pad Thai.
Pad Thai.
I'm so excited.
Wonderful. Justine, I appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you for being so generous with your time. To our listeners, I hope you pass down this episode to someone in your life who needs it. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye and thank you.